Hollywood, the city of stars, the city of dreams. Some call it a dream factory, but sometimes those dreams turn into nightmares. Meet Josh Trank. Trank burst into the scene with the breakout success of Chronicle, a gritty superhero story that made him one of the hottest young directors in the industry. But his meteoric rise was followed by a spectacular fall. From the total production of Fant4stic, a film mired in controversy and studio interference, to the cancellation of his Boba Fett standalone movie, Trank's career tells a cautionary tale of the highs and lows of Hollywood ambition. In this video, we'll explore how one filmmaker went from being Hollywood's next big thing to becoming a symbol of what can go wrong when art clashes with commerce. What really happened behind the scenes of Fant4stic, and what led to the demise of the Boba Fett project that could have made Star Wars history. This is the story of Josh Trank, his rise, his fall, and the lessons learned from a career that proves that not all Hollywood stories are written in gold. Part 1. The incredible rise and the spectacular fall of Josh Trank. Josh Trank was born in Los Angeles, California. Since he was born in the City of Angels, from a young age he had a fascination with films and the art of filmmaking. He watched films like Edward Scissorhands and, because his father was a documentarian, he even watched movies that usually aren't very conventional for kids his age to watch, like Francois Truffaut films and Coen Brothers films like Fargo and Barton Fink. But also, like many future filmmakers, he grew up watching Star Wars. When his parents split up, his mother moved to Beverly Hills, which earned him a spot on the luxurious Beverly Hills High. Now, Trank came from a relatively humble background compared to his wealthy classmates. This made him resentful, and he developed a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Reminiscing about that time, he said, "I got my shoes at Payless. When you're at a friend's house and they have like every fucking Air Jordan, it shocks you. You feel like a loser." During this time, he also began to read on the young filmmakers of the 60s and 70s that made the new Hollywood movement, who worked from within the system but also against it. Mainly, he was particularly moved by the showdown between director Terry Gilliam and Universal Pictures to release his final cut of the 1985 masterpiece Brazil, documented in the book The Battle of Brazil, Terry Gilliam's vs. Universal Pictures in the Fight to the Final Cut by Jack Matthews. It's kinda prophetic that a book about a battle between a visionary filmmaker and a major film studio was one of the key books of Trank's formative years. Trank himself said, "For me, as a young rebellious teenager, it was like a war cry in my head. That's how radicalized I had to be if I'm going to take my shit as seriously as somebody like him." It seems he really empathized with Gilliam's plight to get his cut of the movie to be seen by the public. Let's call this foreshadowing. So, as Trank graduated high school, the paradigm had shifted. He was a millennial, growing up in an era where young, middle-class people from backgrounds similar to his, like Mark Zuckerberg, had become billionaires almost overnight. This gave him the courage to pursue his dream, and he had one goal set in his mind: to beat Steven Spielberg's legacy. About this decision, Trank said, "I wanted to go make my dreams come true. So I made a deal with my parents that if I didn't get my first movie by the time I was 27, that I would quit. And the reason why I picked 27 is because that's when Steven Spielberg was working on Jaws. I felt like if I couldn't get it at that age, then I'd probably be really depressed or something and then move on." He at first attempted formal training, but after 2 semesters and a half of college, he dropped out. So he started working on menial jobs. By day, he ran 35mm film prints to the labs, and by night, he wrote scripts. He told his parents that he had a backup plan if things didn't work out, but in reality, he didn't have one. While the jobs were menial, he did manage to make contact with some important people in the industry. Among them, he knew Jim Vallely, writer and producer of the sitcom Arrested Development. Keep this in mind, this will become important later. And working with other writers from LA gave him the confidence to believe that he really could make it in the industry. Aside from menial everyday work, he spent his days working as production assistant and watching tutorials on how to make lightsabers on After Effects. Once he learned how to do this effect, he began to work on what became his first taste of success in a way. In 2007, he decided to make a short film. Shooting it in the apartment of a friend, with a budget of $100, he made the clickbaity titled Stabbing at Leia's Uncensored, a found footage short film where a college party goes wrong when two dudes that don't like each other start fighting with lightsabers until one of them gets killed and then the stormtrooper police shows up. Nowadays, this doesn't look like much, but for a 2007 short from the early days of YouTube, done with almost no budget, it's not bad. And most importantly, it shows Trank's ability from a young age, a passion for found footage films, and an affinity towards teenage angst and anger. So he posted it on YouTube and nobody saw it. Desperate, Trank sent a message to a friend who was involved in 4chan message boards to see if he could help him out. This also seemed to do nothing, so Trank went to bed. When he woke up, however, everything had changed. To this day, nothing was as surreal as the feeling of when I woke up the next morning and had 100 emails in my inbox. It had racked up 300,000 views. It went viral. It was on the front page of Yahoo. It was fucking crazy. This turned out to be a turning point in Trank's life, as now several networks had sent him emails trying to get in touch with him, and at the tender age of 22, he had his first professional meeting, which got him a spin-off web series of the show The Kill Point with John Leguizamo, a show about a heist gone wrong where he got to do episodes, or should I say, webisodes centered on Deke, the getaway driver. He was given a budget of $50,000 and said all I wanted to do was a dolly shot. Well, he got to do that and blow some stuff up. By the end of it, his film director reel had something that would make any 22-year-old film student jealous to the core and would have done anything to put their name on it. But one small problem though was that it didn't have Trank's name on it. Because the network had exploited a loophole to avoid showing credits on these webisodes because they didn't see them as spin-offs, they saw them as commercials for the show. So, in the end, Trank got screwed over by the network. The success of the Kill Point webisodes gave him a job as editor in the indie movie Big Fan, but after that, he stopped receiving work. Strapped for cash, Trank returned to Los Angeles and took on any work he could get, whether it was splicing cinematographer reels, working on HBO documentaries or selling pilots to Fox. He did all of it. But none of these went anywhere, so Trank felt he had lost sight of his original goal, to beat Spielberg's legacy, and the clock was ticking. I knew I needed to be making one of these movies by the time I was 27 or I was fucked. So, I needed to be like, I'll die if this doesn't happen. It was all I thought about, day and night, and my 20s were not really fun. So, with this in mind, Trank began work on what became his breakthrough hit. He had thought about the concept of teenagers with superpowers when he was in high school, but it wasn't until he met screenwriter Jeremy Slater and a reasonable amount of Zaza to get the idea turned into a film. Slater said about Trank, Josh had just moved to town, and I was one of the only people he knew here in LA. Trank came up with 70% of the story beats, but Slater came up with some of the ideas that made the project really come together. However, when it came time to write the script, Slater's agent told him to pursue a project that actually promised a paycheck. So Trank was left to his own devices. However, because he had never actually written a script, let alone sold one, it gave him some insecurity about pursuing the project on his own. He said, when you're writing a movie that you're going to make, as personal as it is, you still have to be a bit objective about it. I didn't think I was mature enough to be at that point. So he decided to log on to Facebook. I started looking through names in Facebook for someone in LA who I knew who would tell me that what I was doing sucks. And he landed on Max Landis, the son of director John Landis and former good friend of Red Letter Media. I'm like, oh, this dude will definitely blow my shit out and be rude about what I did. So he met with Landis for a feedback session that quickly turned into an entire writing session. Landis fixed a key problem within the second act of the film, and then, 2 days later, Landis called Trank begging him not to get mad because he had just pitched the movie to some producers who wanted a full script. Trank was pissed, but not in a position to object, so he got to work, and 3 weeks later, Landis sent a finished screenplay to every major studio in Hollywood. Everyone wanted a piece of it, said Trank. So he began to get ready to pitch it to every studio. You'd think he would have been over the moon about pitching his project to major studios, but for Trank, this was a nightmare. I was like, fucking get me out of this existence. Nevertheless, Trank and Landis pitched it to several studios until they landed at Fox, where the daring script would attract younger audiences. While Fox was not used to greenlight small-budgeted films, the confidence that the script had and the confidence that Trank and Landis showed on the pitch was enough to convince Fox to greenlight Chronicle, a found-footage film about three teenagers who got telekinetic superpowers, one being a normal kid, another one being a popular kid, and the other one being an antisocial weirdo. Wait, that's a picture of Josh Trank. Anyways, it seems that his relationship with Fox at this time was good. One executive, Steve Asbell, seemed to genuinely believe in Trank, and he was confident in the project. Fox's then chairman, Tom Rothman, who had complications with the X-Men directors in the past, but had a soft spot for film auteurs, was somewhat mixed on the project. He loved the script but detested the way I wanted to do it, said Trank. So, to appease him, Fox gave Trank $50,000 to make a proof of concept, essentially to prove them that the film wasn't going to evolve into shaky cam nonsense. Trank wanted to use the characters' telekinetic powers to break the mold of found footage films. That way, he could keep the cameras moving without breaking the suspension of disbelief. So he started small. He made an early version of the scene where the characters are testing their powers in a diner and later moved cars with their mind. He had even crazier ideas by the end of it. I thought that by the end of the movie, when I'd have 5,000 cameras rolling around the fucking Space Needle, that it would be so ridiculous and so over the top that it was almost like the movie screaming at the rest of the world to stop making found footage movies because you can't do it after this. The proof of concept did well and Chronicle moved forward. Because Chronicle had a relatively low budget of $15 million, Trank had little corporate oversight. To keep costs down, the film was shot in Cape Town, South Africa, and he would discover that most executives were not really keen on traveling halfway across the world for a low-budget film. Another thing that helped the film not be meddled in post-production was that it was found footage. Because the film was made with very precise actor blocking, action, and special effects, there were few ways for anyone to make editorial changes in post-production. So for Trank, this was great. He had just made the film he wanted to make and had basically absolute creative control, even keeping the dark tone that perplexed the marketing team as they didn't know what genre it was. They didn't know exactly what the genre was. Genre is such a formulaic, stupid, robotic way of thinking about things. You're selling a vibe. The trailer cutting houses, on the other hand, were like, this is gold. And in the end, Trank would be proven right, as Chronicle, despite having a small marketing team, was a huge hit with critics and audiences thanks to positive word of mouth who considered the film far superior than most found footage movies and who liked the darker spin on the superhero genre. With the release of Chronicle, Trank became the youngest director to open a film at #1 at the US box office at age 27, followed by Steven Spielberg at 28 with Jaws and James Cameron at 30 with The Terminator, a record which he still holds to this day. A 17-year-old Trank had started out with a dream. A decade later, he had fulfilled his goal of beating Spielberg at his own game. Saying that this was a meteoric rise would be an understatement. So Trank was on top of the world. He decided to quit drinking and met what he thought was the love of his life, whom he married after just 6 months of dating. I guess that Trank doesn't believe that fools rush in, and that he couldn't help falling in love. So, Trank had it all. An acclaimed movie, a beautiful woman, and the bragging rights of beating Spielberg. So that must have been the happiest time of his life, right? Well, you'd think so, but he didn't know how to deal with his newfound success, and the pressure that came with it. Because Chronicle was a huge success, making 10 times its production budget, Trank was on everyone's mind, and he hated it. A press tour for Chronicle spun him around the world and left him unsettled. His cigarette habit intensified. A 3-hour meeting with Tom Cruise felt surreal in a bad way, but most importantly, Trank was angry, but he didn't understand at what exactly. All I felt was anger towards things. Anger towards kids I grew up with. I didn't feel any happiness from that. I don't know how to embrace happiness. But I was having meetings with Margot Robbie and Emma Stone and Amber Heard. Maybe he was right about not feeling happy about that last one. 2 weeks after Chronicle's release, Trank, the man who had just beaten Spielberg, felt adrift, and he punched through a wall in his house and cracked his hand on a steel beam. I think Trank's quote paints a vivid picture of a young filmmaker grappling with the psychological toll of sudden success. On paper, Josh Trank was living the dream. Critical acclaim, industry recognition, meetings with Hollywood's elite. But success doesn't erase baggage, it amplifies it. For someone still carrying the anger of past wounds, sitting across from Margot Robbie or Emma Stone isn't a triumph, it's a contradiction, the validation of your talent juxtaposed against the unresolved emotions you can't outrun. In many ways, this is a textbook example of how success in Hollywood can be as alienating as it is rewarding. Trank wasn't just stepping into a new world, he was leaving behind an old one that had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully processed, and rather than feeling like a conqueror, he felt like an imposter, someone burdened by his past, even as the industry tried to crown him as the next golden boy. What makes this particularly tragic is the way that it exposes the fragility of the human connection in Hollywood. The industry surrounds you with opportunities and relationships that feel larger than life, but if you're not in the right headspace, those opportunities don't feel real. They feel hollow. Trank was meeting with some of the biggest stars in the world, but those moments weren't a reward for him, they were a reminder of the disconnect between where he was externally and where he was internally. Trank had a lot of pent-up anger and didn't know how to deal with it, or who to ask for help, so he called the most famous director on his contact list, El Mariachi and Shark Boy and Lava Girl director Robert Rodriguez, whom he met during the press tour for Chronicle. While they weren't necessarily friends, Trank still considered his advice as Yoda-esque, as talking with Rodriguez helped him deal with his newfound success, and he even sent him a box of self-help guides. Trank says that since he was 18 he has had a lot of pent-up anger and frustration. I've always had a feeling in anything that I've ever done in any stage of my life as a post-18-year-old that I'm in hell. But I'm crawling out of it. I'm always on a path, crawling towards the light. But that was all behind the scenes. To the general public, and most importantly, to the big studios, Trank was the next big thing, so every major studio in Hollywood scrambled to offer him to make a movie. Warner Brothers offered him the chance to direct the spy thriller Red Star, based on the comic book. Paramount offered him the chance to direct Ready Player One, and he declined twice. Sony wanted him to direct an adaptation of the acclaimed video game Shadow of the Colossus, and not only that, they also offered him the chance to make a Venom movie for them, which he wrote with his mentor Rob Siegel as an R-rated comedy inspired by the Jim Carrey movie The Mask. The Red Star project didn't move along. The Venom script he wrote was hated by Spider-Man producer Matt Tolmach, and Trank doesn't remember that experience too fondly either. I didn't like how Matt Tolmach was coming at me in that situation, because it felt kind of authoritative, Trank said. Well, if you don't like what I'm doing, and you're telling me that I have to do something along the lines of what you want, and you're going to tell me in this way, sorry, but I have other things I can be doing. His stint on Shadow of the Colossus adaptation was brief. So brief in fact, he barely remembers the story, but he does recall that his writer delivered one of the most awkward, squirmy speech I've ever seen before. In 2020, Trank stated that he had no interest in returning to that project today. He said, "I'm in a very different place now, where I couldn't give a fuck about any good video game or turning any property into anything else." Which is fine, but that makes me wonder, why was he even interested in adapting Shadow of the Colossus in the first place? He seems to have no attachment to the game, so why did he even consider it? Why would you make an adaptation of something you seem to have no knowledge or passion about? Though, it seems he did make the right call, because as it turns out, most Sony movies and most video game adaptations tend to be complete and utter garbage. Believe it or not, this project is still alive somehow, with director Andy Muschietti taking over the project after Trank left, and as recently as January of 2025, he announced that the project could still happen and has stated that because of budgeting concerns, it has stalled. So, who knows? Anyways, because Chronicle was a huge success and left the door open for a sequel, Fox was very interested in making Chronicle 2, something Trank had zero interest in doing, but the film's other writer, Max Landis, was more than willing to do so, so he wrote a script for a possible Chronicle 2. Trank described the script as fine and having nothing to do with why I wanted to do the first one. When the sequel picked up steam, Trank did everything he could to stall progress. I made it difficult for them to set up meetings, I was dodgy about stuff, I did a lot of shitty things, because I really didn't ever want to see Chronicle 2 happen. That was my worst nightmare. First of all, I'm not doing it. Second, if someone else does it, then you know it's gonna be a piece of shit. It seems that Trank won this battle, because in late 2017, Landis was accused of sexual assault by several women, effectively ending his career, and Chronicle 2 petered out.
It petered out. It petered out. It died on the vine. It died on the vine.
In the end, it seemed that the studio that was the most eager to give Trank a chance to work on a big budget film was Fox. After all, Fox was the one that gave Trank his first shot at a movie, so if there was one studio willing to buy into the hype, it was Fox. So, in late 2012, Fox offered him the chance to direct their second attempt at making an adaptation of Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four. Here's the thing though, because Chronicle was a huge success and all studios were rushing to book him for a new movie, Trank's head grew a little too big for his own good. I mean, when arguably the most influential film critic of all time, Roger Ebert, says this about Chronicle, sometimes a movie arrives out of the blue that announces the arrival of considerable new talents. Yeah, your ego tends to inflate a little bit.
Well,
Josh Trank,
you're pretty great at this
directing.
stuff. Just be careful your head doesn't get too big. What did you just say to me, you little prick?
Because of this, he wasn't interested in making any Fantastic Four movie. He was making his Fantastic Four movie. He thought that his darker and grittier approach to the source material was just what it needed in an era where Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy had changed what superhero movies could be. Even though the studio offered him a chance to make something different, Trank wanted to make a Marvel movie because in his words, it felt like the most rebellious thing to do. He was confident in his take on the project and Fox believed in the hype. So they gave him pretty much complete creative control and a budget of $150 million. A pretty big rise considering he began his career with a short of $100. So this was time for Trank to hit the big leagues. Clearly this was the beginning of a very successful career for Trank. I mean, if he wanted to do a Fantastic Four movie this badly, then he clearly must be very attached to them. Oh, what's that? He knows almost nothing about the Fantastic Four? Oh, well, let's hope this project isn't doomed. Part 2. Doomed from the start. Let's talk about the Fantastic Four for a bit. Since their debut in 1961, they have been some of Marvel's most beloved characters in the comics. Their time on the big screen, however, has been far less, well, fantastic. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, Marvel was far from the movie-making behemoth it is today, and was a smaller studio that, aside from some cartoons, was relatively niche and was constantly on the edge of bankruptcy. So much so that they sold off the rights for the live-action movies of some of their most beloved characters for dirt cheap. With the Fantastic Four being one of those cases, as it was sold off to German film producer Constantin Films. However, to actually keep the rights, they had to make a film, so they quickly, and cheaply, assembled a film directed by B-movie legend Roger Corman. This incident would be later parodied in Arrested Development.
20 years earlier, Debris Bardot had played Sue Storm in the low-budget version of The Fantastic Four, produced by Imagine Entertainment. When, during Imagine's Christmas party, a drunk lawyer reminded them they'd lose the rights if they didn't make the film in the next 6 days. After a 2-hour search, they found their entire cast. They also proved useful 6 days later at the wrap party.
And, while it was publicized, there was never any real intention of ever releasing the film, and it was just made so they could keep the rights. So while the film was never meant to be seen, bootleg copies managed to make their way onto the public, and you can watch it on YouTube if you are interested. In the 2000s, when superhero movies became more mainstream thanks to the success of the X-Men movies and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, Fox, which found success in the genre with X-Men, bought the rights from Constantine to make a Fantastic Four movie, which got a sequel. These movies with Jessica Alba had a lighthearted tone, but neither critics or audiences were particularly thrilled about these movies. They weren't terrible or anything, they just didn't do anything particularly well, so they were abandoned. In 2008, however, everything changed, as Marvel had risen from the ashes to release Iron Man, the first film of a planned cinematic universe. At the time, this was met with some skepticism. A multi-film narrative with different characters that will all team up in an epic conclusion? Yeah, right. Most studios can't even get one film right, let alone an entire cinematic universe. But as the years went by, Marvel showed that they meant business, and in 2012, the same year Josh Trank released Chronicle, The Avengers came out, which was a massive hit and proved that a cinematic universe could be done and done well. So the race was on for all studios to make their own superhero cinematic universe. Fox decided to revamp their X-Men films by centering on younger versions of their iconic characters, which worked very well. So they decided to do something similar with the Fantastic Four and make a fresh, new interpretation of these iconic characters. However, the main reason they wanted to make a new Fantastic Four movie was because if they didn't, the rights would expire and they would revert back to Marvel. In fact, you could even say that it was this reason that doomed the project, because it was built on pillars of sand. Their main incentive wasn't to make a movie for the fans of the Fantastic Four to enjoy, it was made so that Fox wouldn't lose the rights to Marvel. They had already begun trying with different writers to make the Fantastic Four project work, including the writers that made the first Thor movie. But none of them managed to make the project project work. And seeing how their first attempt at a more conventional superhero Fantastic Four movie didn't quite pan out, it seems that Fox realized that they needed a fresher approach to the source material. Enter Josh Trank, who was at the time seen as Hollywood's next big thing, so Fox, with dollar signs in their eyes and a need for a Fantastic Four movie, they signed on Trank and gave him pretty much complete creative control because, get this, Fox realized that they had maybe micromanaged too much directors in the past, like it happened with the much hated X-Men Origins Wolverine, where they infamously sewed the mouth shut of Deadpool, the merc with a mouth. So clearly the best path moving forward was giving Trank complete creative control. So what could possibly go wrong, right? Things even started out relatively smoothly for Trank. Remember how I told you that he was friends with one of the producers of the show Arrested Development? Well, as previously mentioned, they made fun of the state of the Fantastic Four in film, as in one of the story arcs, Tobias dresses up as the Thing,
Daddy needs to get his rocks off,
and later decides to make a musical based on the Fantastic Four. Guess who decides to hand Tobias a cease and desist letter?
A problem that continued to plague him.
Who are you supposed to be?
Oh, I'm the Thing from Fantastic Four.
You've been served.
Even after he'd lost debris and hit rock bottom.
And not only that, he later says this,
Someone should remake that movie.
which is very ironic because Tobias's musical of the Fantastic Four went about as well as Trank's Fantastic Four movie. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And seeing how I mentioned Arrested Development, I can do this.
Now the story of a wealthy studio who couldn't make a good Fantastic Four movie and the one director who had no choice but to try and make a good movie, its troubled development.
So, with creative control in his hands, Trank went on the defensive. His first move was to hire Jeremy Slater as the writer. Slater knew comic books, he knew story, and, most importantly, he knew how to work with Josh Trank. The two of them would work together in a vacuum, and, because Trank called the shots, he didn't have to pitch anything. Slater said of his first days on the film, Josh just said, "Jeremy's writing for me." And Fox nervously said, sure. Trank's skeleton idea for a Fantastic Four movie was essentially the opposite of every other superhero movie out there, by putting the more action superhero stuff at the end. The end of the Fantastic Four was going to very organically set up the adventure and the weirdness and the fun. That would be the wish fulfillment of the sequel, because obviously the sequel would be, okay, now we are superpowered forever and it's weird and funny and there's adventure lurking around every corner. But the first movie was going to basically be the filmic version of how I saw myself at the time, the metaphor of these characters crawling out of hell. Yeah, I don't think anyone sees the Fantastic Four as characters that are crawling out of hell. Also, a bit backwards to have the action superhero stuff for the sequel and the dark and edgy stuff for the first film, right? But it was when they were developing the script that the single biggest problem that this Fantastic Four reboot had became apparent. Trank and Slater had two completely different ideas of what they wanted the film to be. Slater was a card-carrying comic book nerd that understood what people wanted from a movie about the Fantastic Four, wanted to turn the comic book pages into big, epic CGI set pieces. Trank was the complete opposite. His knowledge of the Fantastic Four was seeing a few episodes of the cartoon when he was a kid, and he had an absolute disdain for the superhero movie genre. Slater puts it succinctly, the first Avengers movie had recently come out, and I kept saying, that should be our template, that's what audiences want to see, and Josh just hated every fucking second of it. This lays bare one of the key reasons Fant4stic was destined to fail. It was a film caught between two warring ideologies. On one side, you have Jeremy Slater, the self-proclaimed card-carrying comic book nerd eager to deliver a bombastic, crowd-pleasing superhero spectacle. On the other, you have Josh Trank, who didn't just lack familiarity with the source material, he actively rejected the genre's convention. This wasn't just a creative disagreement, it was a philosophical rift. Slater's reference to the Avengers as the template is particularly telling. By 2012, the Marvel Cinematic Universe had solidified the formula for blockbuster superhero movies, colorful, quippy, and packed with action and spectacle. To Slater, this was the obvious key to success. But to Trank, the approach represented everything wrong with the genre: commercialized, sanitized, and formulaic. He didn't want to make the Avengers, he wants to make Chronicle, but with a bigger budget and a Marvel logo slapped on the poster. This kind of creative tension isn't inherently a problem. In fact, some of the greatest films in history were born out of conflict. But the difference here is that these visions weren't just in competition, they were diametrically opposed. Trank's rejection of the Avengers wasn't just a rejection of one movie's tone or style, it was a rejection of what the genre had become. He wasn't interested in making a superhero movie, he was interested in making a subversion of one, and that's fine, but it's not what Fox wanted, and it's certainly not what the audience or fans expected from a movie called Fantastic Four. What's fascinating here is the sheer mismatch of priorities between the two creative leads. Slater approached the project as a fan of the source material, someone who saw the Fantastic Four as an essential piece of the Marvel Comics mythos. Trank approached it as a filmmaker, someone who saw the material as a vehicle for his own darker, more grounded sensibilities, and the result wasn't synthesis, it was sabotage. The tragedy of this creative divide is that it wasn't just a difference in taste, it was a difference in purpose. Slater wanted to celebrate what made the Fantastic Four iconic, their family dynamic, their larger-than-life adventures, and their colorful villains. Trank, on the other hand, wanted to strip away the bombast and find something more raw and grounded. That's not necessarily a bad idea, but when you're working in a big-budget studio film based on the most famous superheroes of all time, it's a risky gamble, and in this case, it didn't pay off. I think that the main reason as to why Trank's deconstruction of the Fantastic Four failed is because he had almost no knowledge of the source material. He said it himself, he had only watched a few episodes of the cartoon when he was a kid. If you want to make a dark deconstruction of these characters, you need to understand them. Deconstructions themselves can be complicated and may even alienate a part of the fanbase, as it may be hard for someone to process because of how each one personally interprets these characters over the years. But if it is done right, even if you don't agree with it at first, it grows on you and you understand the deconstruction of the character. However, if you had almost no knowledge of these characters, it's not going to be a good deconstruction because you don't know what made these characters special to begin with. While Christopher Nolan threw away the more outlandish elements of the Batman lore out the window, he still kept elements from stories like Year One and The Long Halloween, which made his Batman movies feel unique, grounded, but still faithful to the source material. Similarly, Zack Snyder, who has had varying degrees of success adapting graphic novels to film, and who seems to have an edgy mentality akin to that of Trank, even he seems to have a great deal of respect for the source material he bases his work on, even though his work is sometimes, frankly, shit. Save Martha! When you're adapting any medium to film, whether it's a book, a comic book, or a video game, you need to know what to take and what to leave. And that's really hard to do if you have no idea about the source material. You could give Trank some points that the previous attempts were more faithful to the comics and didn't work. Hell, you could even give him more credit that maybe a darker and complete overhaul of the Fantastic Four mythos was necessary, as it is kinda hard to point out what is it exactly that people like about these characters that other superheroes haven't done already. The Fantastic Four movies from the 2000s suffered from this big time because you could argue that both the Fantastic Four and its villain Dr. Doom don't have a lot of pathos, which is to say that they aren't exactly the most complex of characters. I mean, the villain is literally called Dr. Doom.
There, it is done. Now that the representative from South Africa has been mind programmed, all of the world leaders on Earth are under my control. And when they meet tomorrow in special session, I, Dr. Doom, shall be voted Master of the World.
Even now you can see that with the new Fantastic Four movie, where they seem to be gearing more towards nostalgia and less about fleshing out the characters. So Trank's approach could have worked if he had better knowledge of the material. It seems that Slater understood this perfectly, so in an effort to creatively engage with the director by any means necessary, Slater loaded Trank up with his comics from his own personal collection, the greatest Dr. Doom stories, his favorite Ben Grimm moments, and Trank felt nothing. The only parts he liked were the early character building moments, you know, before the team became superheroes, but he immediately lost interest when they, became superheroes. Trank was not oblivious to the differing perspectives. As he said, the trials of developing Fantastic Four had everything to do with tone. You could take the most comic booky things as far as just names and faces and identities and backstories and synthesize it into a tone. And the tone that Slater was interested in was not a tone that I had anything in common with. So, as if it wasn't clear enough, these two could not decide what movie they were making. A body horror Cronenberg type movie, a Cyber Private Ryan type movie. It didn't matter what element from the comics they were using, whether it was Galactus, Annihilus, Herbie the Robot, time travel, multiple dimensions, whatever. Trank lost interest when the superheroes had to do superhero stuff. Slater said of this conflict, it didn't matter if they were fighting robots in Latveria, or aliens in the negative zone, or mole monsters in downtown Manhattan, Josh just did not give a shit. In his defense, Trank said that he liked the character of Mole Man, saying, "I feel like I get Mole Man. He's angry and undermined by the system. Gee, I wonder why he likes him." Slater estimated that he wrote nearly 18 drafts and 2,000 pages worth of material during his time on Fant4stic. Only 2 of those drafts made it to the studio, and in an effort to retain control, Trank acted as the messenger between Fox and Slater, leaving certain studio notes out of their conversations and only delivering certain drafts to the studio for feedback. Right from the start of the process, Josh told me I wasn't allowed to speak with Fox without him present. I never saw 95% of those notes. What we're seeing here is not just a case of creative conflict, it's a case study in the breakdown of the filmmaking process. Slater's quote paints a picture of a director so obsessed with control that he essentially kneecapped his own screenwriter, keeping him in the dark and undermining any possibility of a collaborative partnership. The fact that Slater churned out nearly 18 drafts and only 2 even made it to the studio suggests a level of micromanagement that borders on paranoia. When a director feels the need to act as a filter between the writer and the studio, it raises the question, was Trank trying to protect his vision, or was he afraid of what would happen if his collaborators had too much influence? This wasn't just about controlling the narrative, it was about controlling the process. By refusing to give Slater access to the studio's notes and effectively blocking most of his drafts, Trank set up a system where he was the sole gatekeeper of what the film could be. On one hand, you could argue this is the mark of an auteur determined to defend his vision. On the other, it's a recipe for disaster. Filmmaking is inherently collaborative, especially when it comes to massive studio productions. Cutting off communications isn't just unorthodox, it's self-destructive. But even more striking than Trank's control issues is the sheer apathy he expressed towards the Fantastic Four source material. Slater's line, "Josh just did not give a shit," is harsh, but it reveals the heart of the problem. Trank did not want to make a Fantastic Four movie, he wanted to make his own movie, using the Fantastic Four IP as a vehicle. His rejection of robots, aliens, mole monsters, or anything resembling the comic book canon wasn't a creative choice, it was a rejection of the essence of the property itself. And while there's room for interpretation in any adaptation, there's a difference between reimagining the source material and dismissing it outright. In the end, this isn't just a story about a director and a screenwriter clashing over creative vision. It's about the dangers of isolation in a medium that thrives in collaboration. Trank may have thought he was protecting his vision by cutting Slater out and filtering studio feedback, but in doing so he ensured that the final product lacked the heart, the energy, and the cohesion that even a flawed superhero movie can deliver. And that's the tragedy of Fant4stic. It wasn't just a failure, it was a failure that was built into the process itself. This clash between Trank and Slater encapsulates the broader identity crisis of Fant4stic. It's a movie that wanted to be both things at once, a traditional superhero blockbuster and a gritty auteur-driven reinvention, but instead of harmonizing those ideas, it tore itself apart. What's most fascinating about this story is how it demonstrates the limits of auteurism within the studio system. Trank clearly wanted to exert control over every aspect of the production, but that control came at the expense of collaboration, communication, and ultimately coherence. By sidelining Slater and refusing to engage with the source material that fans actually cared about, Trank turned what could have been a reinvention into an act of erasure. And in the process, he alienated not only his collaborators, but also the very audience the film was supposed to appeal to. Unsurprisingly, because Trank essentially sidelined Slater and almost none of his ideas were used, he left after only 6 months. He says that so little of his work was used that the only line that made it into the finished film was this one.
Don't blow up. Don't blow up.
It's a shame because from what we know about his script is that it would have fixed the problems that both previous adaptations and the finished film have, like focusing less on the origin part and being more faithful to the comics. Fortunately for us later, he would get a chance to make a proper adaptation of a Marvel Comics character, as he would later become a writer on Moon Knight. And while you may or may not like Moon Knight, it certainly feels like Slater achieved there what he couldn't achieve on Fant4stic, a darker adaptation of the character while still remaining faithful to the source material. Anyways, with Slater gone, Fox got a bit panicked, so they gave Trank a writer's room to get the script into a shootable condition. Among them, one of the people who came on board was Simon Kinberg, producer of the X-Men movies. Remember him, he will be important later. And while this did speed up the process, production was getting closer and closer, and Fox gave Trank a non-negotiable release date for summer 2015. Because of this, some things had to be rushed. The script did not have a third act, and Trank, being in the center of it all, began to feel the pressure. Someone who worked on the production said, "The only two weapons a movie has are its script and its director, and this one had neither." Trank reflected about his time being in the eye of the proverbial storm by saying, "There are two emotions when you are at the helm of something that will represent you, dread or excitement. There's not a lot in between, there's so much at stake. You want to be mostly excited, but how will the movie affect my life? Did I make a mistake on a shot that could hurt me?" Trank had only directed one film before, but this was completely different. It was something the studio had a lot riding on, and his lack of experience began to show. Still, Trank, being Trank, continued to make bold decisions where he could. He fought with the studio to get Miles Teller as Reed Richards or Mr. Fantastic, and perhaps most controversially, he cast Michael B. Jordan as Johnny Storm or the Human Torch, a commonly white character in the comics, this time played by a black actor. Because he wanted to change things as he felt there was a lack of black superheroes. In fact, his original plan was to make both siblings Johnny and Sue Storm as black, but the studio did not like that one bit, and demanded that he cast someone more like how Sue Storm is in the comics, with Kate Mara taking the role of Sue Storm and Jamie Bell playing Brent Grimm or The Thing to complete the roster of the Fantastic Four. When he made Chronicle, Trank had a say on almost every aspect of the film, but here, his level of micromanagement was not appreciated, as most people in the production were not interested in listening to what a guy that had made one good movie had to say. In a studio scenario, you're basically surrounded by veterans who are going to do a hell of a job doing exactly what it is that they do, said Trank, because it's not your movie. You didn't come up with it, you didn't create these characters, you didn't create this property. This guy was fucking nominated for Oscars. This guy has fucking made 20 movies with Robert Zemeckis. It's a fucking science fiction adventure movie. What the fuck do you need to tell them other than the direction of the agreement between you and the studio? All Zemeckis' production designer needs to know is whether or not this is the take, yes or no. Of course, that type of yes or no still needed producer and studio approval. I was aware of the protocol, but I wasn't really asking. I think this quote perfectly encapsulates the tension at the heart of Josh Trank's experience with Fant4stic, the existential dread of being a creative mind thrust into the machinery of a studio system that doesn't prioritize artistry as much as it does process. Trank's frustration here is palpable. He's surrounded by seasoned veterans, Oscar nominees, and industry pros who, from his perspective, don't need or want his input beyond a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. And while this is often how the sausage is made in Hollywood, it's a nightmare scenario for a director trying to craft a singular vision. Trank's line about the production designer knowing whether this is the take or not is telling. It reveals his sense of powerlessness in a system where he felt less like a director and more like a middle manager. But the key phrase here is, "it's not your movie." Trank understood on some level that he was playing in someone else's sandbox. Fantastic Four wasn't his creation. It was a decades-old property with its own legacy, fan expectations, and corporate demands. And in a studio system where everything from casting decisions to the color of a character's suit can require committee approval, a director's ability to steer the ship can feel severely limited. Trank wasn't naive to this, but his failure to navigate the protocol, his admission that he wasn't really asking, underscores the disconnect between his ambition and the reality of the production process. What's fascinating about this is how it highlights the creative inertia of the studio system. Trank is surrounded by people with impressive resumes, people who know how to deliver the kind of glossy, crowd-pleasing entertainment that the studio wants. But for Trank, this wasn't enough. He wasn't just trying to make a competent blockbuster, he was trying to make his movie. The problem is that the system he was working within wasn't designed to facilitate personal expression. It was designed to ensure predictability, efficiency, and above all, profitability. Trank's frustration wasn't just about being surrounded by veterans who didn't care about his vision. It was about being stuck in a machine that didn't prioritize vision in the first place. This is where the clash between auteurism and franchise filmmaking becomes so stark. Trank's perspective that he was an outsider in a system that never intended to give him any real creative control reflects the broader tension of modern Hollywood blockbusters. Studios hire indie directors like Trank to lend credibility, to give the appearance of artistic integrity, but when push comes to shove, those directors are often sidelined in the favor of the producers, writers, and executives who've been steering the franchise for decades. Trank's frustration then isn't unique, it's a structural issue baked into the studio system itself. And yet, Trank's quote also reveals his own blind spots. While he's quick to criticize the studio and its protocols, there's a lack of acknowledgement of how those protocols exist to manage risk and ensure that the final product aligns with audience expectations. Trank's resistance to asking to engaging in the collaborative process may have been his attempt to maintain control, but it also isolated him from the very people who could have helped him bridge the gap between his vision and the studio's expectations. Filmmaking, especially on this scale, is a team effort, and by trying to go at it alone, Trank set himself up for failure. Ultimately, this highlights the fundamental mismatch between Josh Trank and the kind of movie he was tasked with making. He wasn't wrong to feel out of place among the veterans and the studio executives who saw Fant4stic as a science fiction adventure movie, not a personal passion project, but by failing to navigate the system or to even play by the rules, he ensured that his vision would be drowned out. The result wasn't a triumph of vision over compromise, it was a cautionary tale of what happens when a director's ambitions and studio priorities are irreconcilable. And here's where things get interesting. Fant4stic began shooting in the summer of 2014, but what happened during it is mired in NDAs, legal red tape, and most importantly, conflicting reports. Trank uses the word omerta, a term that refers to a vow of silence and is used by the Italian mafia to describe what happened during the filming of the movie, with Trank himself disputing and outright denying most of the reports that came out of what happened on the set. So the only way for me to make sense of all of this is by creating a phenomenon that I like to call Schrodinger's Trank. In 1935, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrodinger devised a thought experiment about a cat being placed in a box with a flask of poison that has a 50% chance of killing the cat, meaning that there was a 50-50 chance that the cat was either alive or dead. However, quantum physics states that until the box is opened, the cat is both alive and dead. Wait a minute, why am I explaining this? You've seen The Big Bang Theory, you know what I'm talking about.
Bazinga!
Anyways, the reason why I bring this up is because the story of Fant4stic exists in a strange quantum state where every rumor, every account from set exists as both true and false until we open the box and look inside. But even then, the truth remains elusive because Hollywood thrives on misdirection and the careful curation of narratives. Instead of a cat, we put Trank in the box, and depending on whose account you believe, Trank was either a creative visionary crushed under the weight of studio micromanagement, or an inexperienced director who couldn't handle the pressures of blockbuster filmmaking. The truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in between. But in Hollywood, somewhere in between doesn't sell headlines. In Hollywood, and maybe in life itself, every production is a story, and every story needs a villain. Whether it's the studio, the director, or the harsh mistress that is creative ambition, the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as who gets to tell the story first. Rumors on a production like Fant4stic are like a game of telephone, except instead of a whisper, you have a megaphone, and instead of a quiet circle of friends, you have the entire internet waiting to report on the worst version of what they heard. So, let's try and unravel this web of rumors. For a movie so controversial, according to Trank, the 72-day shoot had no major issues he could recall, with the biggest point of tension being when they were filming a scene where Johnny accidentally hits Sue with a flame ball that Sue manages to deflect with her shield. While they were filming one of the takes for this scene, Trank heard some people talking behind him while the cameras were rolling, to which he yelled, "Shut the fuck up," in the middle of the scene, and that, according to Trank, was the worst thing that happened during the shoot. This, as you will find out, flies in the face of all the rumors we heard before and after Fant4stic was released in theaters. The story that leaked about how things were on set paints a completely different picture, where it paints the main conflict as a battle of wills between Fox and Trank, with Trank being painted as an erratic director that tended to isolate himself from the rest of the crew, some going so far as to say that he was abusing drugs and showed up late all the time. While the Fantastic Four are New York natives, the film was shot on Baton Rouge, Louisiana to cheapen costs, and in a blog post from Louisiana is where these reports began to emerge. One blog post wrote, A buddy of mine was on the crew. Trank showed up to set late or so high he couldn't speak almost every day. Some days he didn't show up at all. He treated the crew terribly. He trashed the house the production company rented for him. From what I'm told, he did a couple $100,000 worth of damage. Trank did so much damage to the house that Fox CEO Jim Giannopoulos came to Baton Rouge and personally apologized to the owners. This was the first of many rumors that began coming out about Fant4stic, and from day one, Trank debunked all of them. In regards to the reports that Trank isolated himself from the rest of the crew and built a black tent around the monitor and cut himself from everybody else, Trank said that it was just a traditional video village, and sometimes you can't actually be standing out next to the camera because the camera is on a fucking dolly. Trank, similarly, had a lot of problems with the cast. With Mr. Fantastic, he casted Miles Teller, that became popular with the movie Whiplash. Trank fought with the studio to get him cast, but during one take, according to one report, Teller's approach to acting, where he questioned even the smallest of requests, got in Trank's nerve, and they had a discussion where they almost came to blows. Seeing how he starred in Whiplash, I like to think that this is how the discussion went.
Look, I can use Ryan's sticks.
Neiman, you lost the fucking part.
No, I didn't. Look, you can't fucking do this to me.
Can't?
Yeah.
When did you become a fucking expert on what I can or cannot do, you fucking weepy willow shit sack?
I earned that part.
You never earned anything. God, you are a self-righteous prick. The only reason you're a fucking core is because you misplaced a folder. The only reason you're in studio band to begin with is because I told you exactly what I'd be asking for in Nassau.
Trank says that it was just miscommunication and laughed at the idea that he almost came to blows with Miles Teller. I already mentioned that he had different plans for Sue Storm, but the studio forced him to cast a white woman, and Kate Mara was chosen. However, it seems that this made Trank resent Kate Mara. Some sources state that he treated her badly, other sources state that he treated her coldly, but no sources state that they got along well. Trank remained silent on the matter, but Kate Mara reflected on the issue later by saying, "The fact of the matter is that my two most horrendous experiences with directors were male directors. Have I not gotten along with a female director? Absolutely. And was it not the greatest work experience? Sure, but there was never a time where I felt this is happening because I'm a woman, where with the male directors, it 100% was only happening with me. It was a power dynamic thing, and on both of my bad experiences, the movies were 95% men, and I was the only woman in the movie." Though she didn't mention Trank by name, it was pretty clear who she was talking about. Though, it wasn't all bad for her, as this was where she met her future husband, Jamie Bell, who plays Ben Grimm / The Thing, and they now have 2 kids and are still married to this day. Maybe they should have casted Jamie Bell as Mr. Fantastic, right? It wasn't just problems with the cast though, he also had problems with how the audience perceived the film. Before the film came out, there already was some backlash to the creative decisions Trank had taken. For example, his later script was more faithful to how Dr. Doom was in the comics, with Doom depicted as a spy who later becomes a herald for Galactus and eventually becomes the dictator of Latveria. However, Trank being Trank, he had other plans for the character of Doom. Originally, he wasn't going to call him Doom to begin with, he was going to call him Victor Domashev, and he was going to be a blogger with programming skills. This idea was so poorly received that they removed all mention of him being a blogger for the film, but his name was going to be Domashev until they changed it at the last minute back to Von Doom.
Wait, what is this? Victor Von Doom is on here.
But the biggest pushback he received was on casting Michael B. Jordan as the Human Torch, with a vocal minority taking to the internet to voice their displeasure with the race swap. How big was this pushback is debatable, but Michael B. Jordan did write an essay on Entertainment Weekly pleading with fans to give the movie a chance, as the casting decision was supported by Fantastic Four creator Stan Lee. Trank, who as we'll see has a tendency to never unplug from the internet, found an IMDb message board where he was getting death threats. I was getting death threats on IMDb message boards saying they were going to shoot me. To find some level of ease, Trank bought a .38 special revolver that he kept on his nightstand.
I'm not a psychiatrist, but...
I'm glad we've got that on the record.
You're not a psychiatrist, but what?
A psychiatrist would say that he was paranoid.
I was so fucking paranoid during that shoot. If someone came to my house, I would have ended their fucking life. When you're in a headspace where people want to get you, you think, I'm going to defend myself. I don't think you need me to tell you this, but anyone who gets a gun because they received death threats on the internet isn't exactly in a good state of mind, and getting a gun doesn't really solve anything, it's not a solution. If arming yourself was the solution for getting death threats on the internet, then maybe Rian Johnson should have hired an army. So it's here where Trank does admit that the movie did put a lot of stress in his life, and that his correspondence with then Fox president Emma Watts was like the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, in the sense that there was never any bad news per se, day, but that there was always the feeling that war could erupt at any moment. In 2020, Trank gave his official statement to the New York Times as to what happened during the production of Fant4stic. I was overly communicative of my needs and my thoughts and my vision. It's just that what I was communicating ultimately didn't line up with what the studio wanted it to be. I'm not trying to paint them as the bad guys, but I think what was going on with those stories was a concerted effort to engineer an image of me to discredit anything that I could have said against the studio when the movie came out. When it came down to things like saying that I wasn't communicating, or I was running away into a tent, or me and Miles Teller almost coming to blows, which is ridiculous, it's very easy to take details and exaggerate them into things that they aren't. On one side, you have Josh Trank, a filmmaker trying to explain the chaotic production of Fant4stic. On the other, you have a flood of reports, many sourced anonymously, many unverified, painting a picture of dysfunction. Somewhere in between those two versions lies the truth, but as it often is the case in Hollywood, truth is secondary to perception. Trank's description of being overly communicative speaks to the friction that often arises between the director and the studio, especially on high-stakes blockbuster projects. To him, the conflict was one of creative misalignment, on a tour trying to realize his vision while the studio pushed for a more conventional, marketable product. But to the studio and the people in its orbit, Trank's behavior could be spun into a different narrative, that of a young director out of his depth, unable to handle the pressure. These two stories aren't just in conflict, they coexist in a state of quantum uncertainty. Like I said, it's Schrodinger's Trank. What makes this especially fascinating is Trank's assertion that there was a concerted effort to engineer an image of him as the problem. Whether or not this is true, it's not hard to see how it could happen. Hollywood productions are multi-million-dollar gambles, and when things go south, everyone involved scrambles to control the fallout. Studios have PR teams and media contacts to shape the narrative. And when a film flops as spectacularly as Fant4stic did, it's far easier to scapegoat a single individual than to admit systemic failure. The most striking thing about Trank's defense, though, is how it directly contradicts almost every report that emerged during and after production. To the public, Trank was portrayed as erratic, combative, and even reclusive director who allegedly retreated into a tent on set and nearly got into a fistfight with the lead actor. But Trank insists these stories were exaggerated, distorted, or outright fabricated to discredit him. The question, then, is not just what is the truth, but also, why do we believe the stories we do? This is where Schrodinger's Trank becomes a useful framework. Both narratives, Trank's and the studio's, exist simultaneously, neither fully provable nor fully dismissible. To open the box and to find the truth would require to access every email, every memo, every conversation that happened behind the scenes, a level of transparency Hollywood is structurally designed to avoid. Instead, we're left with competing stories, each tailored to serve the interests of the storyteller. Trank's story paints him as the misunderstood artist, the other one paints him as an unstable liability, and because we can't resolve the uncertainty, we end up choosing the version that best fits our preconceived notions about auteur directors and corporate filmmaking. For example, once the internet got wind of the behind-the-scenes problems and its separation from the source material, someone leaked a few scenes from one of the drafts of earlier versions of the script to 4chan. Where either Trank himself or someone posing as Trank took to its defense. Now, whether or not it was Trank, we can't say, in part because it was scrubbed from the internet, and when the thread became viral, many people flocked to it pretending to be Trank. And of course, Trank himself denies being him. So what happened? Well, he was asked, how does it feel to be despised not just by an anonymous comic fanbase, but the entire movie and comic book industries because of your arrogant incompetence? And he responded, hated, I have fucking Fox begging me to sign on for another 2 Fantastic Four movies, another Chronicle, and Warner Brothers offering me a 4-year first look. Don't believe what you read online, and just because something isn't accurate to a book doesn't mean it's not an interesting story. When I talked to Stan and Mark about the Fantastic Four take, they loved it, Simon loved it. The only thing stopping it is Fox like the comic book guy and other haters and conspirators trying to tank this just to get some stupid fictional characters back. You're right, it's my vision. Let's be 100% honest here. It is my vision Fox hired me to do, my vision, and to make sure they get a quality film, and they're getting both. Since day one, people have created rumors and lies about me and my film, going from found footage to me tearing up that house. Was I distant? Yeah, I was. If you were on the set of a huge film with Matthew Vaughn and half of Fox breathing down your neck to deliver a film on a specific date and to rush through everything, you do everything possible. Yeah, I wanted to extend the the boundaries. FX supervisor got Otsoi to do some good quality work, which looked great in the dailies, but not what I wanted. Look, okay, here's what I'm trying to say. If you want your Fantastic Four, if you want the real First Family, if you want Doom, ruler of Latveria, if you want Frank and Val Richards, if you want the Power Cosmic, or even the bombastic Bagman, then yeah, my story isn't for you, but at the end of the day, they still exist in your heart and in your mind and in the pages of Marvel Comics. I was hired to write and direct a film and to make it what I thought would be a new way to do it, and so I decided, instead of playing it safe, to go all out, to go sci-fi space and body horror, because that's been done so few times. You can tell any story with these characters, and some are light-hearted and some are dark, but honestly, since issue 1, when they fought the Mole Man, Reed Richards and co. were afraid of being freaks, afraid of what to do in life and completely unsure on how to deal with it. And I love that aspect, the people who have powers but are completely afraid. These are the early days for the Four. They're not even the Four yet, and they never call themselves that, but they for sure are the First Family, just a different one. This is Earth Fox, not Earth 616. So there's a lot to unpack there. In the grand tradition of online mysteries, we have what is perhaps the most Josh Trank post ever, allegedly written by Josh Trank, a sprawling, defensive, almost manifesto-like rant made on 4chan of all places, where Trank, or someone posing as Trank, takes aim at the critics, the fanbase, the studio, and anyone standing in the way of his vision. But of course, there's one small problem. No one can verify its authenticity, which means we've now entered the realm of Schrodinger's Trank, where this statement exists in a liminal state, both true and false at the same time. Now let's be clear, whether or not Trank actually typed these words is, in a way, beside the point, because what matters is how eerily it aligns with everything we do know about his state of mind during the Fant4stic debacle. The unshakable belief that he was fighting against an orchestrated smear campaign, the insistence that his version of the film was bold and revolutionary while everyone else just wanted something safe, the frustration of working under intense studio pressure while also refusing to compromise. It's all there, mirroring comments he's made in interviews, except here, stripped of PR polish, the emotion is raw, the bitterness is unfiltered, and the self-perception is, well, complicated. And that's what makes Schrodinger's Trank such a fascinating phenomenon, because the existence of this post, real or fake, is telling in and of itself. If it's authentic, then it's a rare moment of a filmmaker mid-crisis venting directly into an anonymous and hostile internet forum, which is both bizarre and kind of tragic. If it's fake, then it's a near-perfect parody of Trank's actual attitude at the time, crafted by someone who had a disturbingly keen grasp on his public persona. Either way, the post reflects something true about Trank's experience, the isolation, the defensiveness, and the belief that his movie was being sabotaged by people who just didn't get it. And then there's the post's final argument, the idea that Fant4stic wasn't a bad adaptation, just a different one, that if you wanted the traditional Fantastic Four, you could still find them in the comics, but that was his take, and that, more than anything else, is where Trank miscalculated, because while artistic reinvention can work, it only works if the final product is good. If your radical vision doesn't deliver, audiences won't care about your intent, they'll just reject the movie, and that's exactly what happened here. Whether or not Schrodinger's Trank actually wrote this post, the argument it makes is very real, that Fant4stic failed not because it was different, but because it just wasn't very good. And in another unverified post, supposedly Trank responded to the allegations that he trashed the rented house in Baton Rouge and his alleged drug use. I caused some damage. My dogs didn't do that much, they tore up some carpet, but I'm not leaving my pets away from home while I'm in Baton Rouge filming a movie. I drew on the walls. The actual damage I don't want to discuss, but a new director on big set, there's a lot of issues and hazing. I never did coke, I have a prescription for alprazolam and Lubox, and honestly, really started dosing myself with the alprazolam. Things were changing every day. Are we X-Universe? Are we not? Why am I not allowed to have it in this way? What do you mean this was too scary? Etc. If I pissed them off, it was only because I had to do 100 things in a row to get it right enough for everyone to seem happy. There's a fascinating contradiction here at play, one that neatly fits into the Schrodinger's Trank framework, where the version of events you believe depends on what you want to be true. Did the Trank trash the house? Well, yes, but also no. It was his dogs, but also not his dogs. He did some damage, but we're not supposed to ask what kind of damage. Was he a reckless director spiraling out of control? No, he was just dealing with the pressures of studio interference, but also, maybe yes, he admits he was self-medicating and struggling with an increasingly chaotic production. Then there's the drug angle, which follows the same quantum uncertainty. Trank insists he never did coke, but then immediately pivots to a laundry list of prescribed medications that he was really dosing himself with. He's both the auteur, desperately clinging to his artistic vision, and the overburdened newbie director who just wanted to keep the machine running smoothly. The picture he paints isn't of a wild, out-of-control party boy, but rather of someone frantically trying to navigate a constantly shifting production landscape, being told one day that the Fant4stic was part of the X-Men universe, the next that it wasn't, and never quite sure whether or not the studio would back his creative choices. And ultimately, the line captures that contradiction perfectly. If I pissed them off, it was only because I had to do 100 things in a row to get it right enough for everyone to seem happy. Keyword, seem happy, not actually be happy. It's the fundamental paradox of Schrodinger's Trank. He was both in control and completely powerless, both the misunderstood artist and the source of his own undoing. In the end, what all of this reveals isn't just the complexity of the Fant4stic debacle, but the broader dynamics of power and perception in Hollywood. Studios wield immense influence over the narrative, while directors, especially those without a proven track record, are often left to fight an uphill battle to defend themselves. Trank's version of events may be true, or maybe the studio's version is true, or most likely the truth lies somewhere in the quantum haze between them, but as long as the box remains closed, Schrodinger's Trank will remain an unsolved enigma. But let's back up to when Fant4stic was still in production. At this point, Fox began to lose some faith and took some drastic decisions while the movie was still in production. For one, they slashed the budget from $150 million to $120 million, and according to several individuals who worked on the movie, the studio delayed casting and script approvals and tried to force last-minute script changes to the film just as principal photography was beginning. This exacerbated the issues the film already had, but in spite of all the problems, a first cut of the film made it to the executives.
After the rough cut screening of the movie for the first time, everyone in attendance looks just as baffled at the clusterfuck as we were.
Who were shocked and caught off guard by the dark and morose tone of the film. People would feel uncomfortable with the morose tone. That they felt uncomfortable with the morose tone. That was the goal, said Josh Trank. At least for him. This is, in many ways, the core of the Fant4stic disaster. The studio expected a sleek, marketable superhero film, and Trank delivered a brooding, discomforting, borderline anti-blockbuster. And when the executives saw the first cut, the reaction wasn't just disappointment, it was confusion. This was the movie? This was what they spent $120 million on? A slow, morose, unsettling experience that wasn't for the fans and didn't even try to be fun? And while the studio saw a crisis, Trank saw success, because to him, making people uncomfortable wasn't the side effects, it was the whole point. And that, right there, is Schrodinger's Trank in action, because whether you see him as a misunderstood artist or a director who completely misread the room depends on what you think Fant4stic was supposed to be. If Trank had been making an indie horror film or a dark sci-fi drama, this reaction from the studio might have been a badge of honor, the kind of pushback you expect when you're really challenging the norm. But this wasn't an indie, it was a Fantastic Four movie, financed by a studio expecting to make another X-Men or Avengers-sized hit. So, when Trank claims that this was his goal, the question is, was he sticking to his artistic vision, or was he justifying a creative decision that completely backfired? And that's the contradiction at the heart of Trank's filmmaking approach. He wanted to challenge audiences, but he also wanted to work on blockbuster scale projects. He wants creative control, but he also wants the kind of budgets that require studio oversight. And when those things inevitably clash, he frames it as the industry rejecting something bold and risky rather than questioning whether the risk was worth taking in the first place. Beyond the tone, the main problem that the executives had was that the film didn't have an ending and was simply too similar to Chronicle, which made Trank look like a one-trick pony. So, while reshoots and pickups are standard for Hollywood blockbusters, here they were urgent, but the aforementioned budget cuts meant they had to rush through production with what they already had. This led to one of the biggest problems the film had. A huge chunk of scenes that were shot and even appear in the trailer don't appear in the finished film, because they were either reshot or scrapped because of time and budgetary concerns. For example, a sequence in the trailer where the Thing gets dropped from a dive bomber was cut from the final film. The reshoots were, in short, hectic. Because most of the actors had moved on to other projects, they had to be called in during the weekends. Miles Teller had to reshoot most of his scenes alone in a green screen, and most notably, Kate Mara had to wear a very noticeable wig for the reshoots. They had to also essentially make an ending out of thin air by cobbling together sets from the third act. To show how tight the deadlines were, the behind-the-scenes material shows some of the effects being done as late as 2 weeks before the movie was set to premiere, and though the reshoots were supposed to end by March, some reports state that they lasted until May. And while Slater was long gone by this point of the story, they did have to use some of his material for the reshoots and the third act. As I mentioned previously, most of the scramble to save Fant4stic is covered behind NDAs and legal red tape, but what we do know is that the studio began to push Trank away from the project and hired a dream team of writers to salvage the project, among them X-Men First Class and Kingsman director Matthew Vaughn, Simon Kinberg, and most important to this channel, Drew Goddard, who the people who saw my Sinister 6 video might remember. So here's your chance to watch my Sinister 6 video if you haven't already. Man, if I had a nickel for every time Drew Goddard was in an ill-fated superhero movie, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Trank fought to retain control by attempting to rewrite pages to get his voice back on the film, but these were ignored. So Trank had to confront the producers to get his voice heard. So the studio compromised with him, where they would allow Trank to make his own version while Fox made their own, and that both versions would be screened for test audiences. The studio hired editor Stephen Rifkin, editor of Avatar and the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies, to make the studio's cut of the film, and it seems he chose completely different takes to those that Trank liked, and he essentially became the de facto director. There are some editors, from my point of view, who prefer using takes for pacing over performance, so they'll say he moved out of that quicker or he did this quicker. It's about getting a certain kind of rhythm that they're looking for. While Trank did like some shots, he thought most of the material was cheesy. Unfortunately for Trank, there was never any real competition between his cut and Rifkin's cut, as by January of 2015, it became abundantly clear to Trank that the studio had already spent millions of dollars on reshoots that would fit Rifkin's cut, not his. And the teaser trailer proved that the film was out of Trank's hands at this point. They really do pay attention to what people are saying on Twitter. They took a look at that and they say, shit, people are freaked out about how it's not going to be funny, so we need to spend $10 million to do a comedy rewrite. Trank edited his version anyway, hoping Fox would take select scenes and drop them onto Rifkin's cut. Maybe critics would see those moments and give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe. A sense of loss sank in during reshoots. The contention left Trank defeated, and his new goal to appease the producers who might incorporate as many chunks of his personal cut into the finished product as possible went against his artistic tenets. It was like being castrated, he said of being on the set, which was overseen by Kinberg and producer Hutch Parker. You're standing there and you're basically watching producers blocking out scenes 5 minutes ahead of when you get there, having editors hired by the studio deciding the sequence of shots that are going to construct whatever is going on and what is it that they need. And then, because they know you're being nice, they'll sort of be nice to you by saying, well, does that sound good? You can say yes or no. This time, Trank said yes. He wanted to keep his job. At this point, Trank wasn't directing Fant4stic, he was witnessing it. The reshoots weren't a collaboration, they were a salvage operation, and he was just one more person standing around on set while Simon Kinberg and Hutch Parker tried to reverse engineer something marketable from the footage they had. Trank himself describes the experience as being castrated, but really the process had already begun the moment the rough cut hit resistance. This was just the final cut, no pun intended. And it's here that we see another layer of Schrodinger's Trank, the director both present and absent, participating in the reshoots while knowing that the final product wasn't his. He says he wanted to preserve some of his original work, to sneak pieces of his vision into the studio's version, but at this stage this wasn't a negotiation, it was permission seeking, and the studio, fully in control, let him have just enough input to keep him cooperative. Does that sound good? They asked, and this time Trank said yes. And that yes is important because Trank's story, at least as he tells it, is that of a rebellious filmmaker fighting for his creative vision, resisting studio interference at every turn. But here, he didn't resist. He couldn't. The movie had already been taken away from him, and all that was left was a choice: play along or walk away. And he played along, not because he believed in what was happening, but because, in his words, he wanted to keep his job. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable question. If Trank himself had already given up on Fant4stic, Why should anyone else care? The producers saw the reshoots as damage control. Fox saw the movie as a contractual obligation, and the director, the person who should be fighting the hardest for his artistic integrity, was just hoping to minimize the embarrassment. And if that's the energy behind the film's production, how could the final product be anything else than a disaster? Trank would further elaborate on how he felt during the reshoots by saying, "It wasn't so much I'm looking around going like, this is horseshit. I was just going like, God, I really f***ed up, man. I felt like shit." Most of my memories of being on the soundstage where we were reshooting are standing by the catering table just eating pastries, just being really numb. It's funny because he describes it as tragic, but it sounds hilarious. It's not a meltdown, it's not a screaming match or a walk-off set, it's just a man at the catering table eating pastries, numb, detached, haunted by the slow-motion realization that he's the one who drove the car off the cliff. Trank's recollection of the Fant4stic reshoots isn't operatic, it's painfully anticlimactic, and that's what makes it so resonant. It's not about fire and brimstone, it's about dissociation, that moment when regret isn't loud, it's quiet, it sits with you between takes. It manifests in sugar and silence. It feels tonally like something out of BoJack Horseman, the images of a man surrounded by a Hollywood production pretending to fix a disaster while privately sinking into a pit of self-loathing. The tragedy isn't that he failed, the tragedy is that he stayed, half present, half gone, watching himself in real time become the cautionary tale everyone had predicted. It's the kind of emotional flatline that often gets lost in the broader, messier autopsy of a failed blockbuster. But it's real. It's the kind of moment that sticks with a person, not because it's explosive, but because it's so unbearably quiet. However, this was all behind the scenes, and the studio, still scrambling to make a commercial movie, had to market the movie by any means necessary. Trank had to try and keep a straight face throughout the summer of 2015. He marketed the film on social media and played hype man on the Jumbotron of San Diego's Comic-Con's infamous Hall H. In interviews, he defended against the finger-pointing with level-headed messaging by saying things like, "It's been a challenging movie for all the right reasons." For a few months in 2015, Josh Trank wasn't a director, he was an actor in a different kind of movie, the behind-the-scenes PR campaign for Fant4stic. He wasn't just the director, he was the salesman, promoting the film on Twitter and Facebook, standing under the bright lights of Hall H at Comic-Con, hyping up a movie he already knew had slipped from his control. It was a performance, and for a while, he played the part well. In interviews, Trank stuck to the script. He didn't lash out, didn't place blame, didn't let the cracks show. "It's been a challenging movie for all the right reasons," he told the Los Angeles Times, a line so polished, so carefully neutral that it could have come straight from a studio press release. But that's the nature of these blockbuster productions. Once you sign on, you don't just direct the movie, you become part of the machine that sells it. And so, for that summer, Trank gritted his teeth and did what was expected of him. He smiled on stage, he answered questions, he helped maintain the illusion that Fant4stic was a movie worth anticipating. But underneath it all, something was clearly simmering, because the version of Josh Trank who posted that infamous tweet, the one who burned every bridge in a single sentence, wasn't born overnight. He had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for the moment where he finally couldn't keep a straight face anymore. But before we get into that, let's briefly review the film. In the interest of fairness, let's say this movie was in fact saved in editing, and that the film did manage to properly reinvent the Fantastic Four. Nah, that's complete crap, because the movie is terrible. So, let's briefly review to see what went wrong. The film starts out okay, I guess? It shows us how a young Reed and a young Ben met, but it also adds the weird angle of domestic violence to Ben's character, and tying it all with a weird reference to the comics.
Hey, Clobber's time.
I think this is the first of many missteps the film takes. I think Trank believed himself to be some kind of genius by adding domestic violence to the usually lighthearted origin of the Fantastic Four, but it really doesn't work here. Why would your Fantastic Four movie have domestic violence 10 minutes into the film? Anyways, the two meet and build their own teleporter out of Nintendo 64s for some reason, which causes a power outage. The beginning of the movie is not terrible. It sets up the science element of the film and how Reed and Ben are outcasts either by their families or by their peers. I'm not a huge fan of starting out the movie with kids, but it's not the worst way to start the film. Flash forward to the present, where Reed and Ben are still working on their teleporter in their high school science fair, even though they look almost 30, but that's beside the point. The teleporter causes some mayhem and it gets rejected by the science fair judges, but it catches the attention of Franklin Storm and his daughter Sue Storm, who offer Reed a job at the Research Institute for Young People, as Reed wasn't teleporting objects within the planet, but rather to another dimension known as Planet Zero. The next hour of the film is centered on them building a teleporter that would get them all to Planet Zero, and introducing the rest of the characters. Franklin's other son, Johnny Storm, whose introduction feels like a cheap knockoff of the Fast and Furious movies, and Victor Von Doom, a protege of Franklin that was the first one to try and build the portal to get to Planet Zero, who is a reclusive, anarchic, anti-system genius that hates working for the man but does it anyway. And even though they took away the idea of him being a blogger and the Domashev last name, this character just reeks of being a self-insert of Josh Trank. They even look kinda similar, maybe that's why he's the only interesting character of the film. And, like with the It's Clobbering Time line, they find another way to hand-fist another comic book detail into the movie.
Not that it deserves to be saved. I mean, think about it. The people running the Earth are the same ones running it into the ground, so maybe it deserves what it's got coming to it.
Dr. Doom over here.
Very subtle. But here's where the main issue of the film becomes apparent. There's no action for the first hour of the film. Now that's not a bad thing in and of itself, as the movie does seem to be focused on being not a superhero movie but a science mystery adventure. The problem is that movies that do tend to be more science oriented have really interesting characters and situations. This movie doesn't have either. All of the characters are bland and uninteresting. Even Victor Von Doom, that is given something to appear more interesting, is still boring. This also applies to Johnny. He's supposed to be the hot rod bad boy, but he just feels like a lesser version of Chris Evans' character from the previous movies. A review of the film that will become important later sums this up perfectly. There are no people to watch in Fantastic Four, only collections of character traits and attitudes brought faithfully to life by actors who might have mistakenly thought they were hitching a ride on the superhero movie gravy train by signing up for this misfire. If the point of this movie was to deconstruct the Fantastic Four, then it starts off on the wrong foot. Secondly, the whole point of this hour of them building the machine is this will go wrong and they will turn into the Fantastic Four. But this doesn't really work because we already know what's going to happen. And most importantly, we're bored to tears with how the movie decides to structure this. I'm going to use a lot this review because it really does encapsulate exactly what the film did wrong. You don't put the getting powers part an hour into the movie as this one chose to, for some cockamamie reason, postponing the inevitable disastrous mad mission to Planet Zero, which is filled with body-warping cosmic radiation, until long past the point when anyone particularly cares about it. This is one of several cases where the film tries to be radically different than other superhero movies, but ends up making the exact same mistake that the previous adaptation of the Fantastic Four did, which is focusing way too much on the origin story and not enough on them as a superhero team. The other time it does this is when it tries to be edgier by changing the name of the dimension, in the comics known as the Negative Zone, but here it's called Planet Zero, even though Planet Zero sounds sillier than the Negative Zone. Anyways, here's where the film arguably makes the stupidest choice. So they build a machine and get it to work, but then they are snubbed by the government that wants to give the project to NASA. So they decide to get drunk, and Doom complains about how everyone remembers Neil Armstrong and that nobody remembers the scientist that made the moon landing possible, and that the scientists deserve to go to the moon first. This is perhaps the dumbest thing the movie does. Let's start by the fact that Neil Armstrong was an experienced test pilot, and in fact he had already been in space 3 years before the Apollo 11 mission. Not only that, but he had a degree in aerospace engineering, and Buzz Aldrin had a PhD from MIT, so they weren't just dumb astronauts. In fact, most astronauts are highly qualified scientists. Not only that, but the part about how scientists never get credit for their work is also bullshit. For the Apollo program at least, as one of the key scientists in that project was Werner von Braun, who was a pretty big celebrity in the 50s and 60s, and was even friends with one Walt Disney. The reason why we don't hear about him that often today is because he was a Nazi that built B-2 rockets for the Germans. Thankfully, we no longer have Nazis making rockets for the US government. To make this even worse, Victor is a scientist. He should know all of this stuff, but none of the other guys correct him either. In fact, this emboldens them to go to the other dimension before they are taken off the project. Now, I get it, this is supposed to be like Chronicle, where teenagers that have a lot of power make stupid decisions. I get it. One small problem though, it doesn't work. Because in Chronicle, they're supposed to be dumb teenagers that don't know better. Here, they're supposed to be geniuses. You can't have it both ways, Josh Trank. It's gotta be one or the other. Anyways, despite these two massive problems, I will give the film some credit when they get to the other dimension and everything goes wrong and they get their powers. It's actually not bad. I particularly like the part when they return and Reed tries to save Ben, who thinks he is trapped under the rubble, only to find he is the rubble. And then Reed realizes he wasn't crawling, but he was stretching. That's actually not bad. One of the few times that Trank's approach to the Fantastic Four as a body horror movie actually worked. Anyway, so they manage to return except for Doom, who was left there. They are captured by the government, and then Reed manages to escape, but doesn't attempt to save the others. So the US government decides to use the others as weapons, mainly Ben, who is now the Thing. So an hour into this hour-and-a-half film, we're still wrapping up the origin story. Christ. Well, thankfully, from this point onwards, the film gets much better. And by much better, I mean much worse. Because here the movie takes a complete 180 and starts becoming a superhero movie. But by this point, it's too late. You can make this movie become a superhero movie well after the halfway point. The movie also fast forwards a year. Reed is now on the run before being captured, while Sue and Johnny are training to be made weapons, and the only reason they haven't is because they're not combat ready. But Ben apparently is, and has done several missions at this point. And that's another thing. One of the biggest missed opportunities of the film is that we don't understand at all how Ben feels about being turned into this rock monster. You'd think we could get some interesting drama about this, but we barely get any scenes to understand him other than that he's angry at Reed. Anyways, the government has built another portal and they find Victor, who was presumed dead and has now officially turned into Dr. Doom and wants to destroy the planet. And this is where we get the second and last cool moment of the movie, when Doom escapes and he starts fucking shit up. I find it hilarious that Victor, the one who was the most against working with the government, as he knew that the moment they found a new dimension, the CIA could use it for nefarious purposes, and then when they get superpowers, that's exactly what it happens. The government uses them as weapons and even deploys the Thing in the Middle East. So the movie unintentionally sides with the villain, and when he returns to Earth and starts killing people, I don't really blame him. They left him there to die for over a year and they didn't even try to save him, and when they did build another portal, it wasn't to save him. They found him there out of mere coincidence, which means that no one even attempted to check if Victor was still alive, and they were clearly going to turn him into a weapon as well. So yeah, you go Victor, you show him. You crush those imperialist pigs before they turn you into a weapon like they did to your friends. So Doom tries to create a portal to consume Earth. This is where Franklin tries to stop him, fails, and gets killed. His death only serves to motivate the Fantastic Four to stop Doom. You know, something great power, something great responsibility. So they travel back to the other dimension to stop Doom, where they can't stop him alone, but they can stop him together. And because this happens 15 minutes before the movie ends, they do. Doom is defeated, and they return back to Earth, where they basically strong-arm the US government into giving them a base of operations without government interference. And that's another missed opportunity. Why would the US government be threatened by 4 weirdos with superpowers? If they said no and declared war on the Fantastic Four, now that would have been a much better ending and sequel hook than what we actually got. But they cave and give them what they want. And we close this movie with the worst line of the film and possibly one of the worst lines in superhero film history.
Gotta say, it's fantastic.
Say that again?
It's fantastic.
Yes, it is.
Guys, I got it. Ready?
Wow, that was terrible, like really terrible. I don't think they could have ended the film any worse. The only thing I can say is that Trank likely had no involvement with this line, but whatever genius came up with that should probably never work in a movie again. And for better or for worse, that's the only line people remember from this film, because it has sort of achieved a meme status on the internet. Actually, you know what? I take it back. I think all movies should end with stupid explanations that are the title of the film.
All right, gang. Whiplash.
Say that again?
Whiplash. Yes, it is.
So yeah, the finished product was a disaster. From a structural point, it feels like it has an elongated first act, a second act, and a 20 minutes third act. The best way to describe this film is that it's a superhero movie that didn't want to be a superhero movie. Now that alone could have been interesting, but that cool concept gets thrown out when the film does become a superhero movie and gives us a final battle that feels cheap, unoriginal, and most important of all, joyless. The result is a movie that feels fundamentally disconnected from its own identity. Fans of the Fantastic Four were alienated because the film lacked the vibrant, adventurous spirit of the comics. General audiences were confused because it wasn't clear what the movie was trying to be, and internally the production was a mess because the people responsible for bringing the film to life weren't working towards the same goal. By the time the movie reached production, it wasn't clear if it was supposed to be a superhero film, a body horror drama, or a nihilistic deconstruction of the genre itself, and because it couldn't commit to any of those ideas fully, it ended up being none of them. I'm going to quote this review one last time to end my own review. The tone and structure of Fant4stic should be studied in film schools as an example of what not to do. It's as if somebody took two pretty decent feature-length movies, broke them into pieces, and re-edited them into one film, but without any discernible plan beyond get this down to 90 minutes. This is not a shortness issue though, it's an everything issue. I'm not convinced that the movie's problems could have been solved with more scenes. Better scenes, definitely, and better characters and better dialogue. Teller, Mara, Jordan, and the rest are excellent actors. We know this from seeing them in other movies. If you encounter them here for the first time, you'd wonder what anyone saw in them. There is a whorishness to the big-budget superhero genre right now, a palpable sense of opportunism and greed that gives even the most earnest entries a faintly cynical veneer. Movies like this one, which show no outward evidence of having been created for any reason other than to make money, do nothing to dispel that. Assigning blame for a disaster is always a tricky thing in reviews. Unless critics have intimate inside knowledge of everything that happened during a production, they end up citing other people's reported articles, which might or might not be accurate depending on who's supplying them with facts and what their agendas are. We do know that Trank got fired off of one of the Star Wars spin-off films, that he and the producer on both that film and Fantastic Four don't like each other, that his enemies have painted him with the dreaded adjective difficult, and that Fantastic Four underwent extensive reshoots in the months leading up to release, and Trank was not present for them. All of this complicates typical sentences in film reviews that treat the director as the captain of the cinematic ship, rightly or wrongly. I have no idea why this movie is so terrible, only that it is terrible, and there is no joy in noting the terribleness of a film. So yeah, it seems no one was satisfied with how the movie came out. Fantastic Four fans were disappointed, general audiences were disappointed, Cronenberg's body horror fans were disappointed, comic book fans were disappointed, critics were disappointed, the studio was disappointed, Josh Trank was disappointed, and I was disappointed because this movie fucking sucks. And Fox was keenly aware of this fact, so they tried to delay the inevitable by delaying and in some cases refusing to give pre-release screenings for critics, which is never a good sign, but there was only so much they could do, because sooner or later the reviews were going to come out, and come out they did. So yeah, most critics didn't like the film, and even those that did said the film was mediocre and not terrible, hardly a rave review. But in the midst of it all, there was Trank, much like he had always been, unable to turn off the computer, just watching every single critic absolutely tear to shreds the film that bore his name. And Trank, who up until this point had kept his mouth shut and did a good job on selling the film, just couldn't take it anymore.
You fucking...
On August 7th, 2015, hours before his $120 million comic book reboot opened on almost 4,000 American screens, director Josh Trank hit the self-destruct button, provoked by the review I quoted earlier, mainly a part that said that Fant4stic should be studied in film schools as an example of what not to do. He tweeted in blind rage something that would fundamentally change his career and how audiences saw Fant4stic. A year ago, I had a fantastic version of this, and it would have received great reviews. You'll probably never see it. That's reality though. The people who championed him saw it as a bold attack, sticking it to the man, while his detractors thought he was just throwing gasoline onto the bonfire that was his career. But let's back up for a second. Let's remember how this all started out, with Trank as the kid with a dream in high school, who felt like an outcast living in a world where all of his peers flaunted their wealth while he lived modestly. Remember, he said, "I got my shoes at Payless." When you're at a friend's house and they have like every fucking Air Jordan, it shocks you. You feel like a loser. This quote paints a picture of Josh Trank as someone who, from an early age, saw himself as an outsider looking in, growing up with a foot in both worlds, living modestly while surrounded by privilege, fostered not just ambition, but also a deep-seated chip on his shoulder, that feeling of being the odd one out, of being surrounded by people who had access to things he didn't. That clearly left an impression on him. When he talks about his friends having every fucking Air Jordan while he got his shoes at Payless, he's not just describing a financial gap, he's describing the emotional weight of feeling lesser, of measuring self-worth against material success. And this kind of formative experience doesn't just disappear, it carries over into adulthood, into career choices, into how you navigate success. If you were bullied in high school, the feelings of distrust and anger against being treated differently don't just disappear, they become part of who you are. You can draw a straight line from teenage Josh Trank feeling like an outsider among his wealthier peers to the filmmaker who landed a massive blockbuster deal but still felt he had something to prove. Trank didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to validate himself, to prove that he deserved to be in the same room as Hollywood's elite. And when he finally got there, that underdog mentality didn't go away, it calcified in something more volatile, more defensive. The same chip on his shoulder that once motivated him started to weigh him down. This is where the irony of Trank's trajectory becomes clear. Chronicle, his breakout hit, was about teenage alienation. It was about feeling powerless, about resentment bubbling under the surface until it finally explodes. And, in many ways, Trank's own career followed a similar trajectory. He went from being an outsider in Hollywood to a rising star practically overnight, but instead of embracing that success, he seemed to carry that same defensive posture, the same sense of me versus them, into his interactions with the industry. And when Fant4stic fell apart, it wasn't just a professional failure, it was personal. The kid who once felt like a loser at his friend's house, surrounded by wealth he couldn't access, was now a director in a system that still wasn't really his. It wasn't his property, it wasn't his story, and ultimately it wasn't his victory. It was Josh Trank versus the world, and the world won. So, when Trank describes himself developing a chip on his shoulder as a teenager, it's not just a footnote in his backstory, it's a fundamental piece of his creative DNA. It shaped the kind of stories he told, the way he approached success, and ultimately, the way he responded when things started falling apart. Because when you grow up feeling like an outsider, you can carry that mentality with you even when you're on the inside. And, if you're not careful, that chip on your shoulder can start to look a lot like self-sabotage. Trank was a fan of the Battle of Brazil, the behind-the-scenes account of Terry Gilliam's legendary war with Universal over his dystopian masterpiece. Gilliam, through sheer force of will and a bit of public shaming, managed to wrestle the film away from the studio and release it as he intended. Brazil went on to become one of the most celebrated films of all time, a triumph of artistic vision over corporate meddling. Trank, however, did not get his Brazil moment, he got Fant4stic. And if Brazil was a case study in how a filmmaker can take on the system and win, Fant4stic serves as the cautionary tale of what happens when you take on the system and lose. The difference comes down to more than just reputation. Gilliam had a finished, uncompromised cut of Brazil that critics and audiences could rally around. Trank insists that his Fantastic Four was taken from him, reworked into something unrecognizable, but crucially, there is no Trank cut to champion. There was no underground screening of his version making the rounds in Hollywood. There's no hidden masterpiece waiting to be unearthed. There's only Schrodinger's Trank, a film that both exists and doesn't, simultaneously the victim of studio meddling and a project doomed by its own internal contradictions. At the end of the day, Brazil was a movie worth fighting for. Fant4stic? That's a little harder to argue. So, Trank and the studio began playing the blame game, each seeing the other one as the culprit behind the disaster that was released onto theaters, and most of it is kept under wraps. If you recall, Trank used the word omerta to describe what happened. This is, in a way, fitting, as it absolves both sides of guilt. Because it's confidential, Trank can deny the rumors that paint him as a reclusive director and basically a prima donna and blame the studio. Similarly, Fox can act like they try to salvage the movie from the erratic director unwilling to be a team player and cooperate. Basically, Trank blames the studio and the studio blames Trank. You know what they say, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. That's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in Hollywood, when a movie's reception often dictates not just who gets the credit, but who gets the blame. And if you ever needed a case study in how quickly a studio and a director can disown a film, look no further than Fant4stic. Before its release, Fant4stic was being positioned as a bold reimagining of Marvel's first family. Fox was eager to push the idea that this wasn't just another superhero movie, it was a grounded, gritty, Chronicle-style reinvention, and Trank, a young, ambitious director with a breakout hit under his belt, was the face of that reinvention. The studio wanted Fant4stic to be a critical and commercial success, a new start for the franchise. Trank wanted it to be his statement film, and for a brief moment, everyone was on the same page. But when the movie was torn a new asshole by critics, suddenly Fant4stic belonged to no one. Trank, in an unprecedented move, took to Twitter the night before release to tell the world that his version of the movie would have been great if only the studio had let him make it. Fox, on the other hand, scrambled to distance itself from Trank, painting him as an erratic filmmaker who lost control of the production, and the result, a movie that exists in a kind of cinematic purgatory, where multiple competing narratives exist about who's really to blame. And this is where Schrodinger's Trank comes into play, because both realities, in a way, are simultaneously true and false. Yes, Fox imposed reshoots and changes that stripped away much of Trank's original vision, and yes, Trank's leadership on set was reportedly chaotic and unstructured. But in the end, both parties found it easier to blame each other than to own up to the film's issues. Fox didn't want to admit that they had mismanaged their production, and Trank didn't want Fant4stic to be the movie that defined his career, because in Hollywood, success has many fathers. If Fant4stic had been a hit, you can bet Fox would have celebrated their bold new direction, and Trank would have been heralded as the next great blockbuster auteur. But when a movie flops this hard, suddenly the director was always a mistake, the studio was always skeptical, and everyone was just doing their best under the circumstances. Let's get back to Trank. So, with a single tweet, Trank did what no amount of studio meddling could. He completely severed himself from Fant4stic. He disowned it, live for the world to see. It was the kind of career self-immolation you almost never see in Hollywood, a director publicly disavowing their own studio blockbuster before opening weekend had even begun. And that's where Star Wars comes in, because before all of this mess, during the production of Fant4stic, Lucasfilm was preparing to create a new generation of Star Wars movies, and Josh Trank was among the lucky few directors that Lucasfilm was interested in, as they needed a fresher approach to tell stories in a galaxy far, far away. So let's jump to Lightspeed and see what happened with Trank's Boba Fett movie. Punch it, Chewie! Believe it or not, but I wanted to make the whole Josh Trank saga into one video. But it wasn't until after I recorded all of this that I realized, yeah, that's not gonna be possible. So I decided to split it into 3 parts. In part 2, we will take a look at what happened to Josh Trank's cancelled Boba Fett movie and other Star Wars projects that were supposed to be the future of Star Wars, but for one reason or another, didn't come to be. And in part 3, we will take a look at Josh Trank right where we left him here. What happened to him after the Fant4stic debacle, and how did he try to redeem himself by making his next movie. If you don't want to miss any of these videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you to everyone that made it all the way to the end. I know not a lot of people do it, so I appreciate those who do. Regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.